Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupam Anyavilashodjitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namni Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachido Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Huido Murachita Jeva Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna Upajibe Priti Janivera Serariti Shuni Lei Borohoihit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhakta Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Maha Sagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad Shri Krishnadas Kaviraja Gosvami, a graceful swan in the inexhaustible reservoir of Gaura Lila, wherefrom the nectar of Krishna Lila streams in the 10 directions. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Caitanya-caritamrta. So we're in Madhya Lila, chapter 22, Sanatan Shiksha, and we've come now to the definition of Shraddha. We're discussing in the midst of the prakaran about the eligibility for the path of bhakti that Mahaprabhu is teaching to Sanatan here, the path of Uttama Bhakti or Shuddha Bhakti. We've come to discuss the eligibility for that, and it was explained as per the recently cited verses in the Bhagavatam that one who has Shraddha has eligibility for this path of bhakti. So what exactly is Shraddha? That we'll get into specific detail today. So a very important subject, a very fundamental subject, as everyone is well acquainted with. Rupa Gosvami Pad, as will be cited also later here in the Caritamrta, describes 8 or 9 stages in the self-manifestation of prema within the heart of a sadhaka. And the first of these formal stages that he lists is Shraddha. So to understand this, to acquire this, is to take up or to begin that process. So this is central to the path taught by Rupa Gosvami Pad, taught by our Goswamis. So, without further ado, you should have the file there in the box, and we're on verse 62. So, in the next payar, Sriman Mahaprabhu explains the intended meaning of Bhagavan Sri Krishna's usage of the word Shraddha in the aforesaid verse from Srimad Bhagavatam. That is, the Shraddha that makes one eligible for the path of bhakti, and thus eligible to relinquish the path of karma. Shraddha shabde vishasa kohe sudrida nischay. Krishna bhakti koile sarva karma krita hoy. The word Shraddha means, or refers, to conviction, vishwas, completely firm resolve, that when one performs Krishna bhakti, all karmas are performed. So in the previous verse that we discussed in the last class, it said that one no longer has the eligibility to follow the path of karma when one acquires eligibility for the path of bhakti, and that it's actually a fault to continue to engage in those activities of karma if one has acquired Shraddha in the path of bhakti. So, but nowhere is there any excuse or any loophole for someone to not do what is a meaningful contribution to the whole of which they are a part. In other words, as we discussed earlier, the jiva is an angsha of Bhagavan. It's a part of this organic or this ontological whole, and it has a responsibility, it has a role within that whole. So when it's in a state of embodiment in samsara, within human society, then that role or that duty is played out in the form of adhering to the duties that a person following the path of karma has to the devas, the rishis, the ancestors, the parents, human society, and so on. But if someone understands that the ultimate responsibility of that part within the whole is to he who is the whole, or who's the angi, the bearer of all of those angas or angshas, the angshi, Bhagavan, and they act so as to serve and to satisfy Bhagavan, then they can be excused from those more elementary or immediate responsibilities. So, in all cases, the responsibilities are to be observed. It's not that one is quote-unquote independent or free to do whatever one likes. One, by their constitution, is outfitted with responsibilities. In modern, liberal political systems, there's a lot of, emphasis on freedom and things like that. And that has its place. I'm not going to start talking politics here or political philosophy. But along with that, there should also be a concept of responsibility. If I may, though, there's one quote of Viktor Frankl, if anyone's ever heard of him. He made a remark about the United States of America, saying that for those who aren't familiar, in New York, which is historically the area where the most new people would arrive into America, there's this Statue of Liberty. And, America prides itself on this idea of some sort of convoluted notion of freedom. I won't go into that. But Viktor Frankl's remark was that if you have a Statue of Liberty on the east coast of your country, then you should have a statue of responsibility on the opposite coast. Because there's no such thing as rights without corresponding responsibilities. And in other words, it's only when there's a balance between people's understanding of these two things that they can become, healthy, contributing members of society, and there can be a meaningful, functional society. So here in this context, in the Caritamrta, we're talking classical Varnashram society, but this is a broad notion which more or less applies in the same way, that the whole path of Varnashram Dharma is laid out with this idea that people are born with responsibilities, and there's much more emphasis on what are your responsibilities than what are your liberties in the midst of those responsibilities. From the Shastric perspective, the orientation is much more towards the responsibility side of the coin than the liberty side of the coin. So, in this case, where we're talking about becoming free from those responsibilities or neglecting those responsibilities, it should be borne in mind that one's only neglecting those responsibilities for the sake of observing a superior responsibility. In other words, there's no actual neglect of responsibility. There's just an acceptance and an adherence to a higher order of responsibility. And it's that deepening, if you will, of acceptance and adherence to responsibility that enables one or justifies one letting go of one's existing responsibilities. So that's the contextual, the context of how this statement is made in reference to the previous verse. So the previous verse is saying you can leave the path of karma and take up the path of bhakti when you get the conviction that by doing that, you're actually fulfilling the ultimate responsibility. So in other words, there's no rope given anywhere for entertaining the idea that it's a good idea to conceive of any activities independent of the responsibilities that one has. So if one has this conviction that by serving Bhagavan, or that when bhakti is done to Bhagavan, all responsibilities are fulfilled, then one is right and one is eligible to leave aside those other things that have now become, so to speak, redundant, as we'll see in the coming discussion, and simply engage in Krishna bhakti. But before we get into all that, we'll look a little bit at the etymology of the word Shraddha and some other important understanding of what this word means and what it connotes within the system of our Goswami's theology. So, let me dive into the commentary here. The word Shraddha is constructed from the root Shrat, one of 6 words that is synonymous with the word Satya, according to the Nigantu, and the affix da. Given that the primary meanings of the word Satya are truth and goodness, and that the sense of the affix dha in the context of its usage in the word Shraddha is that of placing or attributing, the word Shraddha can, that should be literally, convey the sense of, quote, placing truth in something, or placing goodness in something. In other words, to invest the idea that this is desirable, or this is good, or that this is real, or that this is true. So it's interesting then that it's not defined as a recognition of something that's existent in an object, but rather an attribution of a characteristic to the object being done by the perceiver. Because if it weren't defined that way, then it would create the problem of the idea of mistaken belief. Or in other words, sometimes people, so to speak, hold something to be true or believe something to be true that's actually false. So then you would say, you're not allowed to use this word for that. So rather, when the word is defined as not recognition of a certain truth in an object, but rather attribution of the presence of truth to the object, then, okay, then you can even do that in a case of being mistaken. Or you can, place or conceive or attribute the idea of something being good or being truthful, whether or not that's actually the case. So the point being that Shraddha isn't here defined, or in and of itself doesn't have a specific object. It could be applied to anything. So what ought it to be applied to, and what is it applied to in the context of its usage here, that's what remains to be discussed. But I start with this etymology because this etymology illustrates very clearly how Jiva Gosvami and how Visvanatha Cakravarti have defined the word in their works. So, the Amar Kosh thus defines the word Shraddha as firm conviction or sampratyaya, and desire, spriha. So conventionally people like to translate the word Shraddha as faith or something like this, and that's fine. But more specifically, we get a twofold notion of the word Shraddha from the Amar Kosh based on its original etymology, which is one, a conviction in something, or a certainty about something, which is where the faith translation is coming from, but it can also mean desire for something. In other words, once, goodness or truth has been attributed to something, that in and of itself is to desire it. In other words, you only desire something that you've invested with the property of being desirable. In other words, of having some merit or some goodness within it. So in that way, the word Shraddha also means desire. Sri Jiva similarly explains in his Harinamrita Vyakarana that, quote, one has Shraddha, Shraddha dhati, means one determines or one desires. So just as the Amar Kosh gives this dual sense of the word Shraddha, so too does Jiva Gosvami. And then we can see the way Chakravarti Pad gives an extended definition of the word based on the point I referred to earlier, this famous statement, Ado Shraddha of Rupa Gosvami, when Chakravarti Pad is glossing that verse in his Madhurya Kadambini, then he gives a twofold interpretation, which is based on this twofold etymology, which Jiva Gosvami has also mentioned, and is found in the Harinamrita Bhakaran, in the Amar Kosh. So Chakravarti Pad says it like this in the Madhurya Kadambini. Quote, it is constituted of firm conviction in the meaning of those particular shastras, that is, the bhakti shastras, and is adoring desire, that in form is a singular flow related to them, that in form is the sole cause of progressive endeavor for the object taught in the shastras. So we'll come back to this definition later, but this definition is excellent. And the purpose of the remaining part of this commentary is to demonstrate why. So it clarifies what is the object to which the Shraddha specifically applies, and it also underscores the second sense of the term Shraddha of being desire, and what the effect or what the outcome or the indication of the presence of such desire is. In other words, it produces a motivation or an endeavor to achieve the object, which is singular. In other words, which prevents someone from simultaneously doing multiple other things at the same time. So it makes one one-pointed, it makes one motivated, and it determines what is that object on the basis of which such motivation is acquired. So this will all become more clear as we look ahead. In addition to the aforementioned etymological underpinnings of this definition of Shraddha by Sri Chakravarti Pad, the specification in this definition of Shraddha's object being the Shastra specifically can be traced to definitions of the word Shraddha given by Sri Jiva Pad. Quote, Shraddha specifically is conviction in the meaning of Shastra. Shraddha is conviction in the meaning of Shastra that arises through hearing Shastra in the association of a sadhu. Such definitions of Shraddha can be observed to have further precedent in works of earlier acaryas, such as Sadananda Yogendra Saraswati and Sripad Shankaracharya. So if we look in the earlier Advaita Vedanta discourse that precedes that of the Goswamis, we see that they've also defined Shraddha in a more or less equivalent way. So the notion of Shraddha here within the Gaudiya Sampradaya is not, although you could say the specificity of its object is unique, the general constitution of what it is consistent with what is shared by Sampradayas more broadly. In other words, other Sampradayas following the Shastric tradition. So, quote, Shraddha is conviction in the statements of the Vedanta taught by the Guru. And that's a statement of Yogendra, Sadananda Yogendra Saraswati, and Shankaracharya. He gives it like this: affirmation through discernment of the veracity of the statements of the Shastra and the words of the Guru. This is said by the wise to be Shraddha, and by it the existent, meaning the ultimate reality, Brahman, is perceived. So one point that's very noteworthy is that by making the object of the Shastra, of the Shraddha, the Shastra, and specifically the veracity of the statements in the Shastra, then what is excluded? Or in other words, what is not mentioned to be the object? So noteworthy is that it's not mentioned a person. In other words, the Shraddha that makes one eligible to follow this path of any Sampradaya and of any form of Shastriya Bhakti is that one's Shraddha is fundamentally in the Shastra and not in a person. In other words, it's not the charisma of a charming singer or a charming lecturer or whoever that one, thinks, well, this guy's just so wonderful, whatever he says, I'll just believe it. That is not what's going on here at all. That is like out of the ballpark. And unfortunately, that type of Shraddha is very common. And I don't say unfortunately in the sense if people want to have that kind of Shraddha, fine, I have no problem with that. But what's unfortunate is that people assume that that's also what the Gaudiya Sampradaya is all about, and that by having that type of Shraddha, that makes them a follower of these teachings and a follower of the Goswamis. This is where the rub comes. In other words, people who've promoted the tradition in some form or another, their followers, clap them up to be so great and, praise their personal character and activities and achievements up to cloud 9, so that, people are there thinking, oh, this person is just so wonderful, I'll just follow whatever this person says. So, for people to acquire that type of conviction, if they're happy with that, let them be happy. But that doesn't give them eligibility for this path, or they haven't yet come to the Sampradaya yet, even if they think they have or they're told that they have. As per the definition, unless and until one is taught Shastra and has conviction in the meaning of the Shastra that they were taught, they're not even on the game, they're not even on the inside the playing field, so to speak. So this point is important to understand, that what the Goswamis set up and what they envisioned for posterity was something that was very refined. It was something that required systematic education and very careful deliberation on the part of an individual. And that hearing from a sadhu about Bhagavan, about Harikatha, about, the Bhagavatam, about all these commentaries on the Bhagavatam, that this is an indispensable process. This is not an optional, ornamental thing. This is the means to acquire conviction in this path, and the means by which prema will become manifest. It's not whimsical, it's not loose, so to speak, but it requires very clear and precise attention in order to foster the appropriate ideals. So as we've discussed in the past, sorry, I'm elaborating a little bit extra today. This is just an important subject, the topic of tat kratu nyaya, that the principle of specific intention, which Jiva Gosvami deals with in, 51, Anucheta 51 in the Priti Sandarbha, somewhere in there, he cites 4 or 5 statements in that regard, and something that comes up elsewhere, this idea that yat chittam tanmayo vasham etad guyat sanatanam. The eternal secret, the underlying principle of the entire culture of the Shastra is that you attain to whatever you absorb the mind in. Whatever is the specific thing that you think of, that you conceive of, that you desire, that's what your karmic destiny ends up bringing you to. There's no two ways about it. It's just a simple principle that the way that the mind is conditioned, that's what will determine the way that the mind functions in the future, and people do whatever their mind dictates. So to acquire, the ability to focus the mind on something that is otherworldly, something that is divine, something that is truly worthy of being aspired for, one has to acquire a conception of that. One has to acquire an understanding of that thing in order to cherish it, in order to aspire for it, in order to culture it, in order for the mind to become absorbed in it. So unless and until one learns it, unless and until one hears about it from a suitable person, then that won't happen. And then there's no scope for a person having conviction in that, because you can't have conviction in something that you have no conception of. So in this way, we see that the way that Shraddha is defined, Shraddha being the first step in the self-manifestation of prema, is based on hearing Shastra from sadhus, and thereby acquiring conviction in and discerning what it is that the Shastras say, and having faith not just in the books, not just, I blindly accept whatever this book says, even though I don't read the book or I don't understand what it means, but rather that I have come to grasp what is the actual object that the book is describing, and I have conviction in that. And as we all know, it's not so easy to do that. The work of the great acaryas like Rupa and Jiva and others is to illuminate or show what is that artha of the Shastra. So to read these works of the Goswamis, to read these commentaries, this is like the most directly nourishing thing for the mind to acquire an acquaintance with, to become impressed by, to then foster desire for and conviction in that most, worthy ultimate object. There's no more efficient and effective means than this. So this will become more clear as we continue talking, but this is broadly speaking what's going on, but then there's more specificity to it at that. In other words, there's conviction in the meaning of Shastra as a simple definition, but then more practically, when they're saying Shraddha's conviction in the meaning of Shastra, what is that meaning that they're talking about? Is it just all of the meaning? Is it some of the meaning? Is it a particular meaning? Which meaning? What meaning? So that also has specificity, as we see from other points of discussion. So we'll look at that now. Sri Jivapad elsewhere summarizes the process by which someone who hears Shastra from a sadhu, that is, a Shravan guru, goes on to acquire Shraddha in the path of bhakti specifically, in contrast to the path of karma. So this is in the Bhakti Sandarbha. If through hearing deliberation upon the meaning of all the Shastras, beginning with Vedanta, from a proper guru, that, meaning bhakti, is understood to be the supreme necessary practice, or this avashya parama kartabhya, and furthermore, if one develops capability for contemplation and absorption in contemplation, which dispel contradictory notions, in other words, if one acquires the understanding that bhakti is the supreme necessary practice, and one can also explain why other things are not that, and understand the distinction between bhakti and karma, and bhakti and gyan, and bhakti and other types of paths, such that one can see why other things are not fit to be regarded as that, and why bhakti specifically is, then that, namely bhakti, is attainable through practice, upasana, by those endowed with Shraddha. So from this we understand that this, quote, meaning of the Shastra refers to what? Refers to the abhideya of the Shastra principally. That would be exactly right. In other words, it's not just, I have faith in some meaning that I read in some page of the book. You take it like that and you're off the field again. So when he says the meaning of Shastra, what that principally means is that the object that the Shastra is trying to teach. And what is that also called? What is the chapter that we've been studying for the last however many months? Abhideya. What is the directive of the Shastra? That's the meaning of the Shastra, because the ultimate purpose of Shastra is to regulate, is to guide the people. So what is the ultimate outcome of that? The Abhideya, the thing that it's dictating that you do, which, as we discussed earlier, Jiva Gosvami also defines as Abhideya as the Vidheya, the thing to be done, and then glosses that word with, guess what? The same exact word he's saying here, kartabhya. So the meaning of the Shastra principally is the Vidheya, the kartabhya that you're supposed to do. In other words, this is all ultimately practical. We're not just sitting here having fun reading books because we like reading books. This is about, acquiring an understanding and then actually living it out, actually doing that. That's what the whole thing is for. So conviction in the meaning of Shastra specifically means conviction that bhakti is the kartabhya, is the vidheya, is the abhideya, which is the collective import of this whole canon of texts. And thus, he says that when one has that ability, then one can practice this. In other words, as we'll see, because unless you have that conviction, why would you do it? If you don't have any motivation for a particular type of activity, you don't start the activity. So to take up the activity, you have to acquire the motivation. So the motivation comes from the conviction in the value of performing it. And that's why all this analysis is done. The explanation of the word Shraddha in the payar under discussion is similarly indicative of bhakti's being the supreme necessary practice, or avashyaka parama kartabhya. I should drop that doesn't need to be there. Which is another way of saying that the path of bhakti is the principal abhideya of the Shastra, as has been explained throughout the earlier portion of this chapter. And in the tippani specifically, there's a typo, with reference to one of the opening verses of this chapter where this conclusion was established. So we spent the first 40-something verses prior to the present prakaran on establishing bhakti as the abhideya, where it began with, all Shastras say that the abhideya is Krishna bhakti, therefore the sages have made this resolve. And in the tippani it was said, the characteristic of the abhideya is that Krishna bhakti alone is the kartabhya, or the action to be performed. So, I just got a little excited there and made these points in my own words, but what I'm just trying to demonstrate is that this idea of the Shastra Artha, or the meaning of the Shastra, refers to the abhideya, which is the same thing as the kartabhya, which is ultimately what one is meant to do. So, we'll look at some further discussion of this subject. This subject matter is further discussed by Bhagavan Sri Krishna in Srimad Bhagavatam. So in another place in the 11th canto, a little after the verses that we just read in the last class come, Krishna also speaks about Shraddha and Bhakti, and there the commentators make some very important points about Shraddha. So the verses themselves are as follows. One who has Shraddha in discussions of me is disinterested in all karmas, and knows that desires are full of suffering, that is, are invariable causes of suffering, yet is still unable to relinquish them, should thereafter worship me, being affectionate, full of Shraddha, and of firm resolve, while both acceding to and condemning those desires, the consequences of which are only ultimately suffering. So we're not going to go into discussion of that whole passage, but just specifically in the passage, the word Shraddha is used twice in both verses, as well as this idea of nishchoy, or resolve, which is what was exactly stated in the payar we're talking about. Shraddha shabde vishas kohe sudrida nishchoy. And here in the Bhagavatam, Krishna is saying drida nishchoy. So the exact way that the word Shraddha has been spoken of in the payar that we're talking about, that exact same topic comes in this verse of the Bhagavatam. So by looking at the comments in the Bhagavatam on those words, we can understand the import of what's here in this payar. So, the characterization of Shraddha in the payar under discussion as, quote, completely firm resolve that when one performs Krishna Bhakti, all karmas are performed, parallels an explanation given in the commentary of Sri Samipad on the aforecited verses of Srimad Bhagavatam, wherein he comments in regard to Sri Krishna's instruction to be full of Shraddha and of firm resolve, quote, one should be full of Shraddha and of firm resolve that everything, meaning observance of all of one's responsibilities, the complete attainment of one's desired object, will come about only through bhakti. So, here you have a statement of Swamipad, which is extremely similar to what's stated here in this payar. In other words, from a critical historical perspective, it's almost like, they're translating this commentary into Bengali, but not that we're asserting that, therefore I'm just saying it parallels that, in other words, we know Mahaprabhu and the Goswamis, they studied Sridhar Swami, they cherished Sridhar Swami, they built their theology off of Sridhar Swami, so that his gloss here of the word Shraddha and Nishchoy may be relevant to the way it's being explained here, it's quite possible. but I'm not going to go out on a limb and say that it definitely is, but it appears that at least to be quite, congruent. Anyway, Sri Jivapad further comments in regard to the phrase full of Shraddha and a firm resolve as follows. So this is a condensation of much of the discussion that Jiva Gosvami goes into in Bhakti Sandarbha about Shraddha. So that goes on for quite a long time. It would get way too long to put it all in. So I've more or less compressed from that the concepts that he introduces, but not all of the verses that he cites to justify them or clarification of what the words mean and so forth, but the actual conceptual flow that he brings out related to what is Shraddha, that I've tried to consolidate here. So, one who has Shraddha is one who has the conviction this itself, that is, the practice of one-pointed bhakti to Sri Bhagavan, alone is the highest good. That is, the most advantageous path to follow. Therefore, because of this Shraddha, one is disinterested in, that is, apprehensive about being further involved in other activities, or karma. One can become a bearer of eligibility for the form of bhakti related to me that is known as one-pointedness, or ananyata. Starting from that state, and not rather can one become so only after the emergence of complete detachment, as in the case of the path of Gyan. Because of its, that is, one-pointed bhaktis being independent of others, meaning other paths such as karma and Gyan, on account of its being self-endowed with all potencies. So, the path of Gyan requires the ability to meditate. You can't meditate completely steadily unless and until the mind is completely purified. So you can't even do the practice, you're not eligible to do the practice unless you have those prerequisites. But bhakti is different from that because bhakti itself has the power to purify the mind. So you can take up the process of bhakti even before the mind is completely purified because it's still actionable even when the mind is not fully purified, and those actions itself will also lead to the purification of the mind. So in that way, he's saying that the way that the eligibility works for the path of bhakti is different than the path of Gyan. But also, a subtlety is coming out here in Jiva Goswami's statement, which is not made in the Caitanya-caritamrta. So this is maybe a finer level of understanding. In the Caitanya-caritamrta, we've just got, if you look at the flow of the text, it simply talks about the eligibility for bhakti. But from this passage here in the Bhakti Sandarbha, it's made clear that what is specifically being discussed is not just bhakti wholesale as a general thing, but this idea of ananya bhakti, one-pointed bhakti, what Rupa Gosvami calls uttama bhakti, what here in the Caitanya-caritamrta is elsewhere called shuddha bhakti. This whole discussion is about that bhakti, not just all the categories of bhakti collectively. So, although that specific, you can infer that from the Caitanya-caritamrta, the way that the conversation flows, if you read it, the whole Sanatana Shiksha beginning to end, you can infer that conclusion, but it's not anywhere directly stated. But here, in this section of the Sandarbhas, Jiva Gosvami makes this point quite vividly, which is important, and he brings out the reasons for it, as we'll get on to. So, where was I? Okay. Dependence on disinterest in karma also does not arise in regard to eligibility for the path of one-pointed bhakti. That is, disinterest in karma is not a requisite for taking up the path of one-pointed bhakti. That, meaning disinterest in karma rather, comes about of its own accord through conviction in the preeminence of bhakti. In other words, once one has conviction that by doing bhakti there's no more need to do such karma, then one becomes disinterested in it because one understands that it's redundant and doesn't lead to any greater benefit than doing bhakti does. Therefore, although there is certainly dependence on Shraddha, that is, on the paths of karma and Gyan, because of the non-emergence of a complete internal and external propensity to follow any such path without it, still here, in regard to the path of one-pointed bhakti, its acknowledgement in particular as a principal criterion of eligibility occurs because of Shraddha alone being the cause of eligibility. Since, here as well, as in the previous cases, dependence on it is because of necessity for a complete propensity to follow the path, and without it, the form of bhakti that is known as one-pointedness does not come about. That is, a complete external and internal propensity to follow the path of one-pointed bhakti does not come about without Shraddha in one-pointed bhakti. So, people don't do anything without a motivation, or what's called a prayojana. A prayojana, as we discussed earlier, is defined as that motivated by which people do things. So, you can do an act of bhakti even unintentionally, even without knowing that you're doing it. As we've discussed in the past, Jiva Gosvami gives these examples: a bird carried in the mouth of a dog around a temple, a mouse trying to flick a burning ghee wick out of its mouth, various instances in which people are not attempting to do bhakti, they're just trying to save their own life, or they're just in the process of dying in the jaws of a dog, or what have you. But nevertheless, they performed an action which is regarded to be an act of bhakti. So they didn't have any shraddha, So in other words, if you're saying shraddha is eligible for bhakti, well, where's the shraddha of that mouse? There was no shraddha. There was definitely no shraddha in the part of that mouse or that dog, or the past life of Prahlad, where he's cleaning the floor of a dilapidated temple in order to, have, some time with a lady in private. He was not doing this as an act of shraddha. He wasn't even aware that, what was going on. But nevertheless, he, as it so happened, cleaned the temple of Narasimhadev on the day of Nrsimha Chaturdasi. So he did an act of bhakti with an entirely different intention and no conviction necessarily in the value of doing so. So then you can get this contradiction. Say, okay, well, these people are being said to do bhakti and they had no shraddha. And now over here you're saying that shraddha is necessary. Without shraddha you can't do bhakti. Well, this doesn't make sense. So to that we say, you're right. And that's why Jiva Gosvami is making this distinction and saying that you don't actually need shraddha to just do an act of bhakti, but to do one-pointed bhakti, to do uttama bhakti, to do shuddha bhakti, to engage in bhakti consistently, not just by mistake or without knowing so, or, on the weekend because it's nice to go for a drive from Vrindavan from Delhi and get, out of the city for the weekend and have some nice sweets with my family, or, whatever reasons people have for, going and visiting some temple, or, praying for the success of the coming marriage, or, all the different things that people, circumstantially may engage in acts of bhakti to do. You don't need shraddha to do any of that. You just need the desire to enjoy or to prolong your life. The motivation for those activities is entirely something else. So his point is that shraddha is necessary to do one-pointed bhakti, to do bhakti in the sense of a path that is an embracing of a higher responsibility than the path of karma, to do bhakti in the manner that is, leads to the attainment of prema and the profound satisfaction of Bhagavan and so on. That bhakti you need shraddha to do, even though bhakti can be effective independent of that shraddha upon people. This is the distinction that he's drawing out. So, if one-pointed bhakti is seen to be performed by someone without shraddha, then it should be understood as follows. It is sometimes engaged in somewhat, and then lost. In other words, some teenagers, they see some stuff on the internet, they think it's cool, they think, oh, let's go from Delhi to Vrindavan, we'll check out Vrindavan. They go down to Vrindavan, they buy a t-shirt, they do parikrama, they eat some sweets, they think, oh, this is so cool, and they go home and they think, oh, let's, sing some Krishna kirtan, and they're doing all of this just, it looks like they're doing bhakti as it was done, and then, a few weeks later they see something else on social media, that's cool too, let's check that out, and then they're doing something else, So in other words, here he's saying, it is sometimes engaged in somewhat and then lost. In other words, somebody might start to do all these activities, and it might seem like they're interested in them, or that they have conviction in them, but they actually really don't. And just as soon as something else eclipses their interests, then they leave it and do something else. So, in that sense, it's only when one acquires this conviction and which is presupposed by an actual understanding of what it is, that someone will be eligible to do this bhakti as it's meant to be done, and in the manner that Rupa Gosvami has defined, Jiva Gosvami here in the Caitanya-caritamrta Mahaprabhu has defined, and so forth. So, simply bhakti, that is, bhakti that is not one-pointed, however, is accomplished without Shraddha, since its being a bestower of results even before Shraddha is heard of. So in other words, it's true, the rat who flicked the ghee wick was benefited, and there are benefits to doing these acts of bhakti even without Shraddha. He is also acknowledging that. Furthermore, this Shraddha is certainly a part of ascertainment of the Abhideya, of the Shastra, because of its being a form of conviction in that. That is, Shraddha is an instrumental cause of learning the import of Shastra, since one who has no Shraddha in Shastra will not have the propensity to learn its import and adhere to it. So in order to ever get the knowledge by which one can have the conviction that makes one eligible, you have to have at first had enough respect to think, okay, this, tradition of texts that have been studied by highly learned people for hundreds and hundreds of years, that's worth considering. That's worth seeing that there's some value in. There might be some, well-preserved wisdom in there. I might benefit from that. This little bit of respect for the idea that one could benefit from that, or that there's some great value in that, at least that much must be there in order for the people to spend their time hearing it, or learning about it, or reading it, and then leveraging that little bit of understanding, if they acquire understanding of the actual meaning and what it teaches, then they can come to the point of having conviction in what the Shastra actually says. And then they'll actually have conviction in performing bhakti as it's meant to be performed. So, he says, therefore, it does not enter into being a part of the practice thereof. That is, Shraddha is not a part of the practice of bhakti itself. In other words, it's part of the motivation by which one engages in bhakti, but it's not an act of bhakti in and of itself. Furthermore, bhakti cannot be dependent on injunctions. That is, injunctions given in Shastra, to produce its results, just as fire and so forth are not dependent on injunctions to cause burning and so forth, because hearing, praising, and so forth related to Bhagavan have such inherent potency. That is, as fire burns things just by its nature, so bhakti, by virtue of its inherent potency, produces its effect in whom it manifests. Therefore, how can it have any dependence on Shraddha and so forth? It can't. So in other words, bhakti, like fire has the power to burn, bhakti has the power to benefit or to purify people, whether you have Shraddha in it or not. This is openly stated by Rupa Gosvami, in where he speaks of the 5 most powerful types of bhakti: sadhu sangha, nam kirtan, bhagavat shravan, maturavas, Srimurti Shraddhaya Sevan. A little contact with these, even without Shraddha, can lead to the attainment of prem. It's true. He says that. But that same Rupa Gosvami, who's saying, even a little bit of this without Shraddha can quickly lead to Krishna prem, he also says that the first stage in the manifestation of that prem is Shraddha in them. This bit is to be noted. In other words, yes, it's true, one can achieve prema without Shraddha by doing these activities, but it's not that you'll go from 0 Shraddha snap to prem, but rather that having started out without Shraddha, doing those activities, prema will start to manifest, and the initial stage of that manifestation is Shraddha or conviction in those things. So in that sense, it's not a contradiction, and it's understood that Shraddha is not a part of bhakti itself. Bhakti is something that is functional and a whole outside of Shraddha, and yet, and although bhakti is also classified as independent, still, Shraddha is considered a requisite for engaging in bhakti, and it's not a contradiction. So if it's clear thus far, then the whole thing is in balance. Therefore, Shraddha is not a part of bhakti, but it is only an attribute of a bearer of eligibility for the form of bhakti that is known as one-pointedness. So this is the distinction. The person who's the agent of the bhakti needs to have Shraddha in order to engage in it one-pointedly. But bhakti in and of itself is not dependent on that Shraddha and can produce an effect on people even without it. So yes, Shraddha is necessary to perform the path of bhakti as it's meant to, and yes, bhakti is independent of whether one has Shraddha or not. Both are the case. So he gives an analogy, lastly. Just as a possessor of wealth, capability, and knowledge is a bearer of eligibility for ritual action. That is, Shraddha is a property of a bearer of eligibility for one-pointed bhakti, just as wealth, capability, and knowledge are properties of or requisites for a performer of karma. So to perform, a particular yajna, you need the place, the time, the knowledge, the resources, etc. Though having those things is in and of itself not an act of karma, but they're the things you need in order to do the act. In that way. Alright, I've got one more quote here. I'll just finish that and then we'll conclude for today. Sri Chakravarti Pad also comments in this regard as follows. Quote, disinterested in all karmas means apprehensive about being further involved in the results of all karmas, both worldly and Vedic, by virtue of understanding the suffering they produce. Thereafter, that is, starting right from that condition, one should be of firm resolve. So, just as to touch back to our original point of discussion, Shraddha was defined as sudrida nishchay, or very firm conviction, that by doing bhakti everything is done. So now Chakravarti Pad gives a colorful interpretation, or when you say firm conviction, then how firm are we talking here? So he wants to evoke some understanding of how firm this type of conviction is meant to be. So he says the following, quote, my attachment to home and so forth may be destroyed or may increase. A crore of obstacles may even to my worship may arise or may be destroyed. If because of offense I go to hell, let it be. That I will readily accept. Nevertheless, I will not give up bhakti, and I do not wish to engage in jnana, karma, or otherwise in anything other than bhakti, even if Brahma himself should come and tell me to do so. Bah. This is a bold remark, right? In other words, the highest of the gods, let him come and order me. Let them send me to hell. Let them put 10 million obstacles in front of me. I'm never giving it up. This is, he's making like a heroic, assertion. So in that way, he's trying to convey something of the spirit of what is this sudrida nishchay. In other words, if you really have conviction that this is the thing to be done, then it doesn't matter how hard it is, you still do it. To put it simply, if you're in a situation where you're threatened with, death, and you may die, then no matter how hard it is, whatever the thing is that is the only way to sustain your life, that's what you do, because you have no other choice. So similarly, if you actually have conviction that following the path of bhakti is better than any other path, then even if other paths are easier, even if they're accessible, even if other people tell you to do so, even if you're socially ostracized, even if they're easier, even if they benefit you more in the short term, whatever the case may be, you follow that thing even if it proves to be very hard, very long, and very unpopular. That will be the test of your conviction. And as most have experienced, you hardly get anything of great value unless you pass some tests and unless you're ready to make sacrifices. So these type of things will be necessary. And for people who have this type of conviction, then the norms of the world, the opinion of society, these things become, as far away and as insignificant as, anything could be. Like they all their apparent sway or significance just completely disintegrates. So all this discussion, all this analysis, all these verses, comments, principles, this is the fruit of them, so to speak. If someone really tries to understand, really, contemplates these things and has the ability to hold a conviction within them, then they'll get this type of fearless resolve to take up the path. And so, we may find ourselves to be lacking in that respect, but we can also think, how successful would such a person be? In other words, if you had that level of adhikar, the path of bhakti would be very easy for you. And that's the whole point that's trying to be conveyed, is that when you have the eligibility, then to do the actual practice is not that difficult. So much of what people struggle with along the path is largely not because bhakti is difficult to do. Bhakti is, as Jiva Gosvami says in the, verse and comments on the Sindhu, that it's a very soft and sweet thing. It's full of contemplation of the Nam, the Rup, the Gun, the Leela of Madhumoy Bhagavan. What's a sweeter, happier thing than that? But the difficulty that people have is not thus with bhakti, it's because they lack this. They lack the conviction, they lack the clarity, they lack the one-pointedness, they lack the purity of mind that you need to do those things. So that's why this whole prakara on eligibility is very important. And we'll get more into those other features of eligibility, such as purity of mind and conviction in these principles as per, textual analysis or philosophical analysis. That will come ahead. And also a little bit more about why specifically bhakti, in contrast to karma and gyan, is the path to be followed. That we'll get another evidence from the Bhagavatam for in the next discussion. So this discussion of Shraddha will go on for another couple classes probably. But today, this payar that we've discussed is, especially in the Bengali-speaking world, is a very famous statement. One of, very, if you were to say payars of the Caitanya-caritamrta on a stack of frequency of quotation, this would be way up in the ranks of, something that's quoted nearly all the time. So, especially for the Bengali community, this statement is very well known and very central to their understanding of Mahaprabhu's teachings. So we've tried to illuminate it a bit with some of the further light that comes out from Jiva Gosvami and the other acaryas to show its scriptural precedent, as well as some of the subtlety that is not literally stated in it, but implied by what's said later in the chapter as per the Bhakti Sandarbha passage we discussed. And hopefully Chakravarti Pad's boldness also conveys something of the color or the practical effect that these things can produce. So I'll stop here. If anyone has comments, questions, corrections, what have you, please feel free. Yeah, just whoever's first.
Here, I'll go if that's okay. Pranam Shri Krishna Sharan Dasa. I have a question specifically on, or related to this topic of one-pointedness. So, if I understood last week's class correctly, it's guaranteed that a bearer of eligibility for bhakti, or a bearer of eligibility for bhakti is guaranteed to be ineligible for fruit-bearing action. Am I on the right track with that, or?
Right, that by acquiring eligibility for bhakti, you lose the eligibility for the path of karma.
Okay. So, then I was thinking during the discussion of Sri Jiva Gosvami's comments that are on page 4 of the PDF. I was thinking, there's this discussion of how it's actually possible to do bhakti without really having shraddha and all of that. And then we have this kind of further specification of maybe what's really important is being a bearer of eligibility for one-pointed bhakti. So that helped to clarify things for me a little bit, because I feel like, so would it be fair to say that that rule about not being eligible for fruit-bearing action that we discussed last week, does that apply primarily to the bearer of eligibility for one-pointed bhakti? or to a bearer of
Yes.
eligibility for any kind of bhakti. Okay, that helps to clarify things a lot for me. So, yeah. And I guess one follow-up question. So would it then, from a practical perspective, would it be accurate to say that someone like me, for instance, I'm quite sure, like it only takes like a half second of introspection for me to conclude that I'm not a bearer of eligibility for one-pointed bhakti. So that means that I probably am eligible for fruit-bearing karma then?
Well, I mean, there's also other rules of eligibility for the path of karma, which you don't have. I mean, I don't know you personally, but you don't appear to be born into the Varnashram society and been trained with, the relevant samskaras and all of that. So, sorry, my friend, you're not eligible for anything. Don't get me wrong. I just mean, classically speaking, in the Shastric sense, nowadays, people like to take the teachings about karma in the Gita and like spin them into this universal idea of like environmentalism and, doing good to your society, whatever it may be. And that there's some scope for doing that if people want to do that. I'm not speaking in that manner. I'm speaking just kind of in the classical way that it's defined within its original social context. So in that sense, people who are born in the United States from European descent and all of that, such people are not raised with any of the samskaras, any of the education, any of the things that, make one eligible to engage in those type of social duties that existed in that Varnashram society, which, in all frankly speaking, is utterly defunct in the modern day. So in that sense, it's those type of things are not entirely relevant to the present day. And, we can say that the way the Goswamis have also shown that the adhikar for the path of bhakti is, one can acquire that irrespective of whether one has eligibility for the path of karma, is actually extremely practical in the modern pluralistic world where the Varnashram society is defunct. Because, otherwise there's nothing that one can enter into, so to speak, without making some like neo-interpretation of things. So the path of bhakti is, as it is defined, even in its, so to speak, strict sense, one can, enter into that meaningfully without doing some cultural appropriation or, reinterpretation or what have you.
Okay, as far as that reinterpretation goes, so first of all, I definitely agree. There's no way I'm eligible for, the type of karmas performed by a twice-born person. All of that stuff. I mean, maybe I could try to pass as a Shudra, kind of, sort of, or something. I don't know. When I read like the Bhagavad Gita, or when I've read the Bhagavad Gita in the past, they have tried to do a reinterpretation or something, which is that like, so karma could refer specifically to the Vedic system, of the Varnashrama Dharma. But I mean, people who've never heard of the Vedic system, like say if you go to Europe, in the, 12th century, or something, if there was very little contact with the Indian subcontinent, they may never even heard of the Vedic system, but they still engage in fruit-bearing action, right? I mean, people still take action with the goal of getting some result. I mean, so previously I'd been interpreting when fruit-bearing action in a sort of general sense, or I've been interpreting the path of karma in a sort of general sense as, not the path of karma yoga, but the path of karma as having to, any sort of fruit-bearing action. But is that a misinterpretation then? Or...
I mean, strictly speaking, in the Gita, when Krishna's talking about karma, he's talking about Varnashram Dharma. He's talking about, karma in that sense means the duties that are enjoined for you by the Shastra. As, but that's what I'm talking about, these like neo and, karma just means an action. It just means, like, you take you can do that, you can just take the word out of context and say it just means any action at all and say it, and then try to apply it universally to any social context. And there may be some scope for applying that, and that may provide some beneficial principles for some people to live by in a particular manner of living. Personally, I'm into the path of bhakti. That's not my problem. In other words, whatever people want to spin that into how to, use the Gita for modern life and all of that, that's cool. That's not my bag. As far as I'm concerned, the main principles of the Gita, we already discussed them earlier in this class. Manmana bhava mad bhakto madhyaji mam namaskuru. There's no doubt that Krishna is ultimately, as per our viewpoint, prescribing the path of bhakti. We're focused there, So how exactly, where you want to go with notions of the path of karma as per the Gita and other social contexts, that's a broad topic. I don't have, the time or the scope to give you an elaborate answer on that at this time. But
okay, that's fine. Thank you. But just to make sure I understand, so I'm sorry, I know I'm taking up a lot of time and there's another person waiting, but just to double check that I understand. So the question, what we looked at last time in particular, of how someone, a bearer of eligibility for bhakti, is automatically ineligible for karma, that in some sense, I don't even have to try to figure out whether I'm ineligible for karma due to being eligible for bhakti. Because I was trying to figure that out. I was like, well, am I eligible for bhakti? And if so, does that mean I'm ineligible for karma? But I don't even have to try to figure that out because I'm not part of the Varnashrama system, so it's
not your problem.
Okay. That's
you're hanging out with bhaktas, hear about Bhagavan, let that make its impression over you. Let these teachings of Uttama Bhakti, let them make their impression over you, and decide what your conscience wishes. That's all you need to worry about.
All right. Thank you.
All right, I think there's another hand.
Hare Krishna, Babaji. Pranam.
Hare Krishna.
Babaji, actually, I want to understand that when we say that Ado Shraddha Tatha Sadhu Sangha, that process whole line, so in that we say that Ado means Sadhu Sangha, as per Bhaktivinoda Vishwanath Thakur.
Yeah.
So from Sadhu Sangha we get Shraddha.
Sure.
We say that Sadhu Sangha is part of Limba Bhakti because Bhakti can come from Bhakti.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, that Sadhu Sangha is part of Bhakti, is a Limba Bhakti, but how we can understand that this Shraddha is not part of Bhakti or Limba Bhakti because it comes through Sadhu Sangha.
Right. So it's, as the point was made here, that it's a characteristic of the bearer of eligibility. It's a characteristic of the state of mind of the person. It's not an internal characteristic of bhakti itself. So it's an effect, it's something that has been acquired or come about as a result of engaging in acts of bhakti. But that result, even though it's produced by bhakti, is not considered an inherent part of bhakti.
So other thing like Shraddha Sadhu Sangha, then Bhajan Kriya is of course it is Bhakti. Then Anartha Nivritti is also not Bhakti. It is part of, it is basically eligibility of that person who is doing Bhakti.
Exactly. Anarthas, the anarthas are where? The anarthas are not in the bhakti. The anarthas are in the mind of the guy, right?
Yes. But then further when we say Asakti, Ruchi, all these things, they are all characteristic of devotee, not bhakti. Can we say?
Well, yeah, you can. I mean, it depends on how you apply them. In that specific context, I think you could do it either way, in the sense that, for example, asakti is something that's not done. Jiva Gosvami defines it as abuddhi purvak, or something that's not done with the intellect, but something that happens automatically at that stage due to the depth of the samskar that's been made. So it's kind of in the gray area, I would say. You could make a case at that point for it being either one.
Okay. Now it's more clear. So then, but limbs of bhakti are like that. 64 are described, 64 or 59 described by Rupa Goswami, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, like that. They are the limbs actually.
Yes.
So one more I want to understand. Today also this part came, as you described, that Shraddha means that which is which is basically the meaning or of Bhakti Shastra for us who are practicing Bhakti. But it is not a like words of a particular person, as I understood.
Mm-hmm.
So, but when we say Guru, so when we say that sadhu shastra guru vakya chittate kariya ek one verse ago. So in that shastra is okay because sadhu and guru tells us about shastra.
Ideally.
Yes, ideally it should be. So it is said that when there is some part of confusion or something which is contradiction, then we should follow two of them and give up one. Because even Shastra, to understand Shastra is very much difficult because we cannot, I cannot understand Shastra independent of a sadhu or guru. So then it becomes one-to-one.
Okay, that, this 2-1 rule is nothing I've ever seen in any of the works of Rup, Sanatan, Jiva, Cakravarti Pad, or anyone like that. What we see in Cakravarti Pad's work, in his commentary on the Prem Bhakti Chandrika, which is the same text that you're quoting, there's a statement which comes later in the Prem Bhakti Chandrika, after the one that you quoted, which says, Shri Guru Bhakata Jan Taharit Charane mon aropya kotha anusare. Let me fix my mind at the feet of the bhaktas or sadhus and the guru, following the kotha. It says kotha anusare. Okay? So he doesn't specify, Thakur Mahashai doesn't specify whose kotha is he talking about. Does he mean, let me fix my mind at the feet of the guru and the bhaktas according to the way that they taught me, according to their kotha? Is that what he means? Or is it some other kotha? So Cakravarti Pad, he comments on that, and he says there, kotha means shastra kotha. In other words, he epistemologically privileges the shastra above the guru and the sadhu. They're not of equal weight. The epistemological authority lies in the shastra. The guru has epistemological authority if and to the extent that he can convey the teaching of the Shastra. The sadhu has epistemological authority if and to the extent that he can authentically represent the teaching of the Shastra. Suppose you have a guru who doesn't know the Shastra properly. Suppose he creates a whole bunch of sadhus. Now they all go around saying a bunch of stuff which is not what the Shastra says, and then people say, okay, well the sadhus and the gurus are saying it, and I don't understand the Shastra, so I'll just do what they say. Then you lost the plot. So that's why these things have to be always studied on the basis of the texts. This is a textual tradition. If gurus want to propagate the quote-unquote sampradaya without actually training people in the works of the Goswamis, such that the people learn the works of the Goswamis in their own words directly, they're not actually representing the sampradaya. And all of the stuff that they may say, all of the claims that they may make, all of the ideas that they may make popular, may be accepted by so many people. But that doesn't actually make them authentic. What makes them authentic is if and when someone can actually, for themselves, demonstrate and realize that this is what the original texts say. In the modern day, when almost all of these things are taught in translation, it becomes even more difficult, because the majority of the people trying to learn these things don't even know the original language to be able to confirm that what they're being taught is accurate or not.
Yes,
so this makes for, mass confusion, and on top of that, when you have people actively trying to propagate whatever opinion they have in mass public printing and distributing, what do you get? You get mass confusion, not just confusion, like pumping out confusion. So, the whole, like, what this is meant to be is for very careful, thoughtful people who sit with a person who's actually been trained in these things, who's actually studied these things, and who go line by line directly through the words of the Nitya Parikaras, Rupa Gosvami, Sanatana Gosvami, Jiva Gosvami, no one else, no intermediary. We want faith, we want to hear the words of the Nitya Parikaras. No one will ever have authority like they do. The words of Bhagavan himself. Uddhava in the Bhagavatam, he says to Krishna, he says, I don't want to hear anyone's teachings, only yours. No one knows the truth except you. You who are the personification of the truth. You who are Bhagavan himself. And so we have faith in that. We have faith in Krishna, in Krishna's words in the Bhagavatam. And in those Nitya Parikaras that, by our Gaudiya principles, we accept Mahaprabhu and his Parikaras as Krishna and his Parikaras. We have faith in them. We want to hear that. We don't care what anyone says. We're not interested in anything else. If someone can represent that to whatever extent of authority they have, to whatever capability they have, good. If they can't, pranam. Unless people have this ethic, the sampradaya will never be kept clean. The tradition will never be kept alive. It'll just become completely something else in the name of all of this. So Chakravarti Pad's comment that I quoted is very important, right? He shows that the authority of the Guru, the authority of the Shastra, of the sadhus, is dependent on, or is to be accepted in accord with what the Shastra teaches. The Shastra said you have to have a Guru, therefore you have a Guru. The Shastra said, hear it from sadhus, therefore you hear from sadhus. The whole point is to acquire the art of the Shastra. That's the object of the Shraddha. So, and where does this all come from? It comes from the teachings of the Bhagavad, right? Jiva Gosvami established the Bhagavad as the Paramashruti, the ultimate Praman. No higher Praman than the Bhagavad. So, what is the whole process then? Hear the Bhagavatam, hear the statements of Krishna in the Bhagavatam, taught by the Nitya Parikaras like Jiva Gosvami. Learn that, have faith in that, that's invincible. That's the highest power of epistemological authority that can exist. Don't cheat yourself and accept anything less. Seek that, have conviction in that, live your life, aspire for your spiritual object on that. That's what this was always meant to be. Bhagavan doesn't want anything less for you than that.
Thank you, Bhabaji, for making it clear. So it means that a person who wants to understand it properly, he must have, for Gaudiya, he must have knowledge of Sanskrit and Bengali. Because for Caitanya-caritamrta, he must know Bengali also.
The more the better. I won't say that it's 100% necessary. Bhagavan is gracious if someone gets the association of a guru who has that Shastric knowledge and can represent it in those languages. Then even if one doesn't have that language knowledge themselves, they can acquire, to a sufficient extent, acquaintance with the principles, concepts, etc. But whether that's actually happening or not, unless they have that knowledge of the language, they don't truly know. If they have faith, good for them. And that's why it's bhagya, right? That's why Jiva Gosvami says, ati bhagya. You only get this samskar by great bhagya, because it's ultimately beyond even your ability to estimate what it is. So it is possible, but when and where is it happening, that's difficult to say.
So, in Caitanya-caritamrta, Babaji, what are the commentary at present, because you are teaching, and I joined, I think, your classes from last 6-7 classes only. So, what, as per, because what I understand, you learned Bengali and then you are teaching all these things. So, from where I can get proper books or proper commentary, I want to understand Caitanya-caritamrta. Because Caitanya-caritamrta, what I understand, they are presenting the principle in very nice way, and the same, the way one should preach. Caitanya-caritamrta is actually preaching to us, how, like the Sanatana Shiksha. how Krishnadas Kadal Goswami is going one by one, and it's like teaching us. But for that, I need a proper commentary or proper translation. So how can I get from where? What is we can say? Because I don't know much Bengali. Basic I can understand, but still it may have some conceptual or siddhantic problems. So that's why which can be a good commentary or translation of Chaitanya Chaitanya.
Today I'm speaking frankly. Today I'll say it's not available. In other words, if you know Bengali, there's many texts out there I study. I have like 15 editions of the Caitanya-caritamrta, which I look at different ones, some often, some rarely, what have you. I can't say I'm satisfied with any of them 100%. And second point, there are some Sanskrit commentaries on the text. None of them are completely reliable. But the other thing to understand is that the Caitanya-caritamrta is a derivative work. It's built off of the Sandarbhas, the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Ujjal Nilamani, the Stavabali, etc. So as you can see, my methodology here, we spend more time on statements of Jiva Gosvami, Visvanatha Cakravarti, and Sridhara Swami than we do on Kaviraja Gosvami. In other words, to understand the Caritamrta, you're ultimately just going through a compressed essence of so many important points that are existing throughout the Bhagavatam commentaries of the earlier acaryas. So you have to pull all of that out, and you have to see where contextually it's all coming from in order to arrive at the right understanding. So in that sense, although the Caitanya-caritamrta is in Bengali, it's an extremely difficult text to do because you have to know the whole gamut of the Sanskrit, works of the Sampradaya in order to understand what's being said when and where. Whereas when you do some of those individual Sanskrit works that don't refer to each other, once you get to the level of knowing Sanskrit, those in some case are actually easier because you can just follow the line of thought and that's it. It's not pointing and quoting and, giving a nuance of so many things elsewhere. It's just presenting its subject matter. So the Caritamrta is actually a very complex thing. And it's, the opus of Kaviraja Goswami's years and years of relish and tutelage with all of the Goswamis. He's blended and woven all these things in to create this beautiful essence of and summary of what the Goswami Grantha conveys. So, there are editions out there in Bengali, Hindi, English. You can get some general idea. But, the main thing you want to do, in my opinion, anybody would be benefited by, is learn the siddhanta of the Goswamis. For that, you need to study the Sandarbhas, you need to study the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and various other works. And here in the Caritamrta, as I'm going through it, I'm trying to present most of everything based on the Sindhu, the Bhagavatam Tikas, the Sandarbhas. And for those who follow these classes, I think it's perhaps tediously filled with details from those original works. Maybe people may well be annoyed I'm not just going simple and more fast through the thing. But I don't find it satisfying to leave things vague, but rather to try to convey the import of what Kaviraja Gosvami has done to show Kaviraja Goswami's brilliance and to show how this is like the icing on a huge corpus. I find that to be one way of doing kirtan, so to speak, of these Goswamis and what they've stood for.
I'm learning actually Sandarbhas slowly, but it takes time actually. Yes, sir. So I saw that your video recordings are available, audio recordings are there. But just I want, because I'm quite new, 6-7 class I only attended till now. So are there books or did you make books or are there any PDFs so that like I see in every class you share a PDF and through that you teaches. So is there any PDFs or book is the same practice for earlier also in your old classes also?
Yeah, for some years now I've been sharing texts to go with the classes. but it's part of an edition of the Caitanya-caritamrta that I'm gradually producing. But because it's still in the process of being edited, I'm not sharing out a whole, large file of it, but I share relevant to the class, as you see, and as you see, I edit it live as we're going.
So, audio. So, is any because I want to start from beginning also, because it is now Madhya Leela and 20.
Okay.
So I think
at this point, I'd say I think we should discuss this later. We've got a whole group here. I don't want to take everyone's time.
Okay, sure.
So
Sure.
you can send me an email or something like that if you want further information. But generally in these classes, we just, what's specifically relevant to the passages that we've discussed, questions and analysis of that specifically is fair game. But broader things we can do without taking the whole group's time.
Sorry, Gauri. Thank you.
All right. So I'll conclude here for today. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama. Jai Guru, Jai Gaur, Jai Jai, Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.